Welcome back to Neon Liberalism. I'm Samantha Hancox-Li. Recently, I was at a conference. There was a panel. They were talking about the right wing in America, the radical right wing in America. And the radical right in America isn't just a political philosophy. It's not just a debate about tax rates. But it's in many ways a comprehensive picture of the world that they are offering people, right? The right in America wants to explain to you why you can't get a girlfriend, why your muscles aren't big enough, why none of it's your fault. And none of this is what we would traditionally think of, in the age we grew up in as like politics. Exactly. Politics is about federal policy and taxes and social programs and testosterone supplements just don't seem to enter into it, but they're everywhere on the right. And I think there's a reason for that. I think people in America are hungry for answers, hungry for a philosophy of life that will speak to their deepest concerns as human beings, to their anxieties over their place in the world, and so on. And so I kind of raised this all to someone on the panel. And I said, we as liberals need to be able to do that as well. We need to be able to speak to the deepest anxieties and needs of people who are young and adrift. And she said to me, well, I don't think we can do that. I mean, that's not what liberalism is. The liberal project just doesn't have anything to say about that. I think that's a problem. And I think to rectify that problem, we do need to go back into history. So today, as part of this Liberalism 101 series, I want to talk about liberalism and the Enlightenment. You may have heard of the Enlightenment. It's a philosophical, social, cultural movement, sweeps across Europe a few centuries ago, and is in many ways connected at the foundations with what we think of as liberalism today. And I recognize that Enlightenment values are often associated with the right today. There are people on the right who want to claim that, the only true heir of the Enlightenment is, Jordan Peterson or Curtis Yarvin or whatever goofy crackpot you've heard of who's destroying liberals with facts and logic. Personally, I think that's BS. And I think the Enlightenment still does have lessons for us as liberals today. So, what is Enlightenment? That is an interesting question. And to answer it, I kind of want to start with the context. To understand history, you have to learn more history, I know. But I want to talk about the scientific revolution. The scientific revolution kind of takes place in reaction to the Middle Ages or the medieval period. The terminology is disputed, but this period in which, in some ways, science and understanding of the world didn't advance very much. Yes, there were advancements. There were especially technical advancements in a wide array of fields, but it's hard not to look at the period from, Rome to the end of the Middle Ages as a period of, compared to the modern world, certainly a distinct lack of scientific progress. Right, that the seminal texts on natural science had all been written 1,000 years ago, whether that's Ptolemy on astronomy or Galen on the body or Aristotle's physics. These are all texts that are ancient, and the scientists of their day, were as much interpreters of ancient texts as they were explorers of the natural world. This starts to change with a number of people. Galileo Galilei is put on trial by the Inquisition in 1633 because he has the temerity to say, yeah, maybe the earth goes around the sun, and then he wrote a book about it. And Galileo's heresy, I mean, you've probably heard of it, was that he actually looked at the stars instead of reading a book from 1,000 years ago in order to understand how the stars moved. William Harvey, uh, less well known, but also very important, writes a book called The Anatomical Experiments, or De Motu Cordis, the motion of the heart, asking this question: what does the heart do and what is blood? Which to us seems like an obvious question. The heart is a pump and it circulates blood. But for 1,000 years in Europe, the official belief was that that's not how it worked at all. And Harvey, working even before microscopes existed, was able to demonstrate the circulation of the blood through the body and how the heart functions as a pump. Again, not by analyzing a passage from Aristotle or appealing to this or that passage in the Bible, but by experiment. And this idea of experiment is codified. That's, again, not really the right way to put it, but is often associated with its philosophical basis. With this other guy, Sir Francis Bacon, also writing in the late 1500s, early 1600s. And how to put this? I don't want to say the scientific method. A lot of people will say the scientific method as if it's like a fixed known thing. I was taught in elementary school that like the scientific method had like 7 steps, and you had to go through them in order, and that isn't real. There's no secret 7-step method for science. Francis Bacon did not invent a secret 7-step method for science. But the fundamental philosophical principle that if you want to understand the natural world, you have to look to the natural world, not received wisdom. And that you have to look to the natural world through experiment, through careful observation. And that these experiments and observations ultimately form the real test of any theory. I don't know, by the way, this is a fascinating little side point, but the recent economics Nobel Prize went in part to Joel Mokyr. And Mokyr's argument is that this is one of the mainsprings of modern economic growth. That sustained economic growth of the kind that built the world around us could not possibly have happened without a systematic experiment-based science. And they just gave him a Nobel Prize, so maybe he knew a thing or two about it. But what I'm trying to gesture at here is this idea that the scientific revolution very much did happen. It's a real event in history that changes the conception of the world, ultimately, of how to approach understanding the world around us. One that's become so pervasive that we kind of assume it was always like this, but it was not. It marks a major revolution. They called it a revolution for a reason. Okay, scientific revolution, that's happening. That's very important. What about the Enlightenment? The Enlightenment takes off when other thinkers and philosophers get this idea that we're going to take the ideas of the scientific revolution and apply them to human society. That we are going to put human social structures to the test of reason, just like we put our scientific theories to the test of reason. So Descartes writes in 1641 Meditations on First Philosophy, often known as the Meditations. And Descartes says, if you want to really understand anything, you have to ask yourself, you have to go through what he calls the method of doubt. You say, okay, well, I think this, but how do I know it? Do I really know it for certain? And, in many cases, the answer is no, that's just some stuff I was brought up believing, but I don't really understand it or know it for a certainty. And for him, the method of doubt takes you back deep into philosophy and into his famous phrase, I think, therefore I am. The thing that you cannot doubt is that you are here and that you are thinking. And everything else, the external world might be, today we would say an AI simulation. He said that there was an evil demon who was, controlling all his perceptions, but he also thought that you could reconstruct religion on this basis, that through a series of unassailable arguments, you could prove that God exists and that God would not deceive you, and therefore you can trust the evidence of your senses. And then that takes you back to the scientific method, right? How do you arrive at theories of the world? Well, you trust your senses and work up from there. Now, obviously Descartes, puts his name to this idea, to the method of doubt, to the idea that we're going to put everything, even the existence of God, to the test of reason. That's kind of what's radical about Descartes, right? It's not just that he says doubt everything, but rather that he's willing to doubt even the most fundamental things in a very Christian Europe. Right. And his answer as to why I believe in God, it's not about faith and it's not about tradition and it's not about the person of Jesus Christ, but it's about reason. He says reason proves that there is a God and that God is good. I've talked a lot, keep coming back to on this channel Thomas Hobbes, but Thomas Hobbes is another good example of how these ideas of reason start getting applied to the social world. Where Thomas Hobbes, when he says, yeah, we should have a king, he doesn't appeal to tradition. He doesn't appeal to the Bible. He doesn't appeal to force. He doesn't say, well, the king has a sword and therefore you should kneel down. Hobbes wants to put even the system of monarchy to the test of reason. And he thinks that reason, again, shows that absolutely you do need a king. We should have a king. We should have an absolute monarch. But ultimately, that conclusion for him is backstopped by reason. And you can see this heritage, this intellectual heritage, in the founding documents of the United States. Again, as I keep coming back to, the Declaration of Independence is a very instructive document as to what our founding fathers were thinking about, and opens with a very striking set of words. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Right, that again, this is not an appeal to tradition, it's not an appeal to culture, it's not an appeal to force, it's not an appeal to the Bible, to any of the things that might once have founded political or grounded political systems. It's an appeal to reason. It's saying you yourself can read these words, you can put them to the test of reason and see that they stand on their own feet and form the reasonable basis for a political system. And in fact, this is all over not just the content of the founding documents, but why we have founding documents at all, why we have documents that explain what we are doing and why and how it's going to work. Right, the preamble to the Constitution starts with an explicit list of goals for the Constitution in order to establish a more perfect union, establish domestic tranquility, etc., etc., etc. The Federalist Papers, famously, is a long series, very good, by the way. The Federalist Papers, totally worth reading, still very interesting, very worthwhile piece of political philosophy. But they are making the public case for the Constitution, again, on the basis of reason, on the idea like, yeah, you, random person in a random town, can read the Federalist Papers and think about it for yourself and decide what you think about whether this is a good idea or not. That you're not compelled by the past, but only by reason. Now, This is, as you might expect, very contentious. People who are in power on the basis of tradition and mere power all over Europe kind of don't necessarily like these ideas very much. Um, but nevertheless, they take root, they take fire, they change the world, as we can see, insofar as there are no more kings hanging around running countries the way they used to. There are no more absolute monarchs in the Western world. But the Enlightenment doesn't really stop there. It doesn't stop with the political system. Once you open that door and start asking that question, what does reason say about our traditions, takes on a life of its own. And here I want to talk a little bit about Immanuel Kant, another philosopher. He's writing in most of the most important stuff in like the late 1700s, stuff like What is Enlightenment, 1784, or his most famous work, The Critique of Pure Reason, 1781. And Immanuel Kant has this idea that reason and freedom are bound at the hip. That what it is to be free is to be a reasoning creature. And this is an idea that I think is correct, and I really want, and I think is central to explaining where we are today. So if you'll bear with me for a moment, in Kant's view, to just act according to tradition, to act without thinking, without putting things to the test of reason, to be pushed and pulled this way and that by your instincts or by your appetites or by whatever half-formed thought you learned in childhood, that's a kind of unfreedom, right? That's not you choosing for yourself. But it is only when you engage your reason, in this phrase from What is Enlightenment, when you dare to know, right? When that you're able to really be free, to be making your own choices. Um, and this connection between reason and freedom is important for Kant, at least in part because he thought you could also reconstruct all good, decent Protestant morality on that basis. Oh yeah, don't lie, don't cheat, don't steal, go to church on Sundays, don't have sex outside of marriage. He's really big on that one. Um, all the stuff that like he personally was in fact brought up with, he thinks, oh yeah, I can put everything to the test of reason and then arrive exactly back where I started. Um, there's even a fascinating passage in the Critique of Pure Reason where he thinks that again, this putting your ideas of like space and time and thought and reality and like how is it even possible to know anything about the external world, he thinks you can like do this radical reasoned critique of these things and then um, through some derivations that are impossible to understand, come back out and derive Newtonian principles. You can derive Newton's physics from principles of pure reason, according to Kant, because Newton's principles, he thinks, are like, correct. And so he has to be able to prove them by a reason, by a pure reason, in fact. And so I think that speaks to a certain tension in Kant where he has these very strong ideas of reason and of freedom, but he thinks they also kind of deliver you right back where you started. Uh, and that's the thing that many of Kant's successors will pick up on. Nietzsche, most famously, but in some ways also Kierkegaard. But I won't talk as much about Kierkegaard. But I'll talk a little bit about Kierkegaard, the Christian existentialist. Kierkegaard's hard to talk about because the way he wrote was like Kierkegaard would write a book under a pseudonym, critiquing another book that he wrote under a different pseudonym. And then he'd write another book that is like, again, he would write it under a different pseudonym that was like the editor's endnote to the previous book. And like, so it's always super hard to like sort out like what is he actually saying versus what is just some words in one of his interlocutors' mouths. And like, that's probably intentional because he doesn't want you to answer like what does he really think. He wants you to think for yourself. He wants you to choose for yourself, but he also wants you to choose like Christianity and this act of leap, like a leap of faith. But anyways, I said I wouldn't talk about Kierkegaard, even though he's very interesting. I'm going to talk about Nietzsche. And in many ways, Nietzsche is a student of Kant. Doesn't like to admit it, but he is looking out at these vistas that the Enlightenment has opened. All these questions that you couldn't ask or even answer, and suddenly they have cracked open like an egg. And I'm actually going to read a passage from Nietzsche because I think it is, because the man can write. The man can really write. And just quite beautiful stuff here. Indeed, at hearing the news, the old God is dead, we philosophers and free spirits feel illuminated by a new dawn. Our heart overflows with gratitude, amazement, forebodings, expectation. Finally, the horizon seems clear again, even if not bright. Finally, our ships may set out again, set out to face any danger. Every daring of the lover of knowledge is allowed again. The sea, our sea, lies open again. Maybe there has never been such an open sea. And that's what I want to come back to, this idea of the open sea, that, as Nietzsche puts it, God has died. All of the old certainties have died. They have been scoured away by the light of reason, and all that's left is an open sea. And what I think Nietzsche understands in a way that Kant only ever gestures at, for example, in what is Enlightenment, is that there is an emotional component to what's happening here. That freedom is terrifying because freedom implies responsibility. Once you realize you're out there on an open sea, once you realize that you can choose your life for yourself, right? That you are free, right? That all the old certainties don't necessarily apply, that you can chart your own course through the social world and make your life what you will. That implies that you're responsible. That whatever happens, that's an issue of your own free will, and that if it all goes badly, if you make a hash of it, if your ideas are bad and you're wrong, like that reflects on you in a tremendously deep way. And that imagining that you're just following tradition, that you're just following orders, that you're just acting the way you were brought up to act is a relief. It's a relief from the burden of responsibility. It's not your fault, right? Okay, well, maybe it'll be a disaster. Maybe it'll all go wrong, but at least it won't be my fault. Whereas, as Nietzsche says, to chart your course on an open sea, to really live your life according to reason, requires a little bit of daring, requires a little bit of boldness, requires you to be okay with accepting responsibility for what happens next. In the high court of your own heart, the high court of reason itself, that it's you who's being judged by your choices. I've talked a bit about tradition, but Nietzsche also thinks that there are other ways of trying to dodge responsibility for yourself. In particular, there's this constant idea, it recurs over and over again. I think it's especially relevant to today and to the reactionary right, which is the idea that we're all just going to live according to nature, according to what's natural, according to human nature as revealed by what happened back on the savannah or evolutionary psychology, because that just takes the burden of choice out of your hands. And again, I think Nietzsche has some great lines about this, which again I'm going to read. This one's from Beyond Good and Evil. You desire to live according to nature, O you noble Stoics, what fraud of words! Imagine to yourselves a being like nature, boundlessly extravagant, boundlessly indifferent, without purpose or consideration, without pity or justice, at once fruitful and barren and uncertain. Imagine to yourselves indifference as power. How could you live in accordance with such indifference? To live is not that just endeavoring to be otherwise than this nature, is not living, valuing, preferring, being unjust, being limited, endeavoring to be different. And granted that your imperative living according to nature means actually the same as living according to life, how could you do differently? Why should you make a principle out of what you yourselves are and must be? In reality, however, it is quite otherwise with you. While you pretend to read with rapture the canon of your law in nature, you want something quite the contrary, you extraordinary stage players and self deluders. In your pride, you wish to dictate your morals and ideals to nature herself, and incorporate them therein. You insist that it shall be nature according to the Stoa, and would like everything to be made after your own image, as a vast eternal glorification and generalism of Stoicism. And he's here criticizing the Stoics, but I think there is a very similar point to be made about all these people who are telling you tales about human nature today and fundamentally projecting their own reactionary project back into history and then pretending to be delighted when they find it there, as if this vindicates them and they weren't the ones who put it there in the first place. And why are they so busy with this song and dance? It's because they're afraid of responsibility. It's because they are afraid of freedom. Because they recognize that in this modern world, you kind of get to choose. And with that choice comes responsibility, and they don't want to stand on their own feet and argue for whatever their preferred political solution is. They want to pretend that it's inevitable. But this to me is, I guess we're practically up to the modern day now, but this to me is the core legacy of the Enlightenment. Is this idea that you are free, whether you like it or not. That you are a reasoning creature, whether you like it or not. And that this creates a responsibility for your own life that you can accept or you can be in denial of. So this has all been highly abstract and philosophical. What does it actually mean for politics and for the liberal project? I promise I'm going to get back to that, but I want to start by asking, well, what does it mean for the individual person? What does it mean for your life? For me, anyways, it means a few different things. One of them is humility, actually. This doesn't really get emphasized very much, certainly not by today's defenders of the Enlightenment, but for me, some of the most important experiences in life are precisely realizing that I've been wrong, realizing that I'm ignorant, realizing that I made a mistake, that whatever I happen to be thinking at the moment isn't infallible, that it is, as Descartes said, something you can doubt, something that you don't know for certain. Sometimes that uncertainty bites you. Sometimes you just get it wrong. Uh, and in practice, that means, I think, a certain humility that people these days hold up reason as this like totem figure. They brandish it at their enemies as if to say, well, I have reason, I have it, and you don't, and that means I'm right and you should shut up. And to me, it's precisely the opposite. If you actually believe in reason, you have to recognize that you yourself are equally subject to that tribunal of reason. You yourself might get it wrong in the future. You have gotten it wrong in the past, and you might be getting it wrong right now. And that requires you to just have a certain, I keep on saying the word humility, but just a certain distance from your own convictions, a certain willingness to recognize, I might be wrong, and that'll be fine. I'll be okay. I can admit that I was wrong about this thing, and I might have to reconfigure a lot of other stuff that I believe on the basis of that. I had that experience relatively recently in my own intellectual life when I started, for me, right, let's get personal about it. A big experience was after Trump gets elected in 2016. I realized that I knew all these facts about history, but I had no idea why history happened. Why did, like, oh yeah, like this thing and then this thing and then this thing and then this thing had happened, right? I learned all these dates in school, but like, why? Why did these things happen and not other things? And I was like caught out in this kind of vertiginous moment of just realizing that I didn't understand how we had gotten here and where we might be going from it. Um, and rapidly, I acquired some ideas about history and about how we had gotten here. Um, and then I read a bunch of books and realized I was wrong. Actually, I was wrong in a pretty fundamental way about the great voters of history. And that's a project that I'm still working on, trying to understand that. But, anyways, the point, as I keep coming back to, is that reason is not an excuse for pretending that you're always right and you can't be wrong and everyone else should shut up. Reason is a reason to keep on subjecting your own beliefs, even some of your own deepest and most strongly held beliefs, to the tribunal of reason. I think it also teaches us about the importance of sociality, right? That, you know, I'm a pretty smart cookie, but I can only get so far by myself, right? You look at the progress of reason in history and you see people working together. Even Isaac Newton knew he was standing on the shoulders of giants. All of the people that I had mentioned, all of these great philosophers, were standing on the shoulders of giants that went before them, were reacting to other ideas from other people, and they were willing to think really hard about those ideas, not just dismiss them out of hand because they were uncomfortable or because they didn't like them or because they had unfortunate implications, but like, I don't know. Maybe it's really time to grapple with what other people have to say. And in my own life, that has always been some of the most valuable intellectual progress has come from other people, from being in dialogue with other people. Just in the silence of your own mind, your heart plays tricks on you. You will smooth over the rough edges of your arguments, the little gaps in your inferences. You can just leap across, and no one's there to call you out on it. And it's precisely in interaction with other people who will say, "Wait, hold on a second. What about that?" Um, and then you're like, "Oh, I guess I got that wrong. I guess I was making an easy inference, or I was making an equivocation, or I was sliding between this or that." And so I think this comes back to both these things I've been talking about, humility and sociality, come back to freedom and the respect for freedom in others. Right, that I recognize, okay, I'm doing my best to live according to reason, um, but I am nevertheless a flawed, frail, emotional human being. And so is everybody else. And just as I respect the freedom in my own heart, I need to respect the freedom in everybody else and to learn from it, to let them chart their own course while also trying to learn from them, and maybe they'll learn from me, and we're all kind of like in this great project of figuring ourselves out together. And so here I think you start to see the connections between these Enlightenment ideals of reason and freedom and these political questions that this channel is so concerned with the liberal project. That ultimately, I believe, liberal societies are the best way for us to live together in freedom, to respect in ourselves our capacity to choose, to respect in others their capacity to choose, and to chart their own course in life. Right? Ultimately, the argument for democracy isn't, oh, like democracy produces 10% like more economic growth and alternative forms of government. No, the argument for democracy is that nobody has the right to rule us but us, right? That tradition and culture and power and authority and all of that contingency of history doesn't really matter. What matters is what we choose collectively. And of course, there are going to be questions about that, right? Okay, well, how do we choose collectively? What are the limits of collective choice as regard to the individual? We've talked about all this stuff on the channel, but the fundamental philosophical point, like I said, is that no one has the right to rule me but me, and no one has the right to rule us but us. That is the legacy of the Enlightenment, and that is, to me, one of the most important foundations of the democratic system. And all the rest, all these fundamental liberal rights, free speech, free movement, free trade, free association, are about respecting the freedom in the individual, for the freedom of the individual to chart their own course in life, to make the best of their time on this world as they can, to the extent that that doesn't impinge on other people's ability to do the same. That ultimately is the basis of all these individual rights. Again, not that, oh yeah, it's as we talked about in the episode on religious civil wars, it's not a mere modus vivendi. Oh, it's not as if we're all just biding our time, waiting to put a knife to each other's throats once we have a big enough knife, but rather the recognition that on a fundamental moral level, other people have as much right to be free as I do. So where does that take us to be today? What is this idea that we must have the social structures to ensure that we all have the autonomy to be autonomous? Um, you know, it's interesting to me to see the right so trying to drape themselves in the mantle of free speech, right? Trying to say, I have been silenced. And so often it seems like what these people want isn't so much free speech as a free audience, and an audience that's required to clap. They want to say that it's rational for white women to be afraid of black men in elevators. That's Amy Wax, by the way, who said that this is rational, right? She wants to say that her own prejudices are vouchsafed by reason, and actually you're all required to congratulate her for, pretending that bigotry is freedom. You can see the same kind of bizarre nonsense in guys like Curtis Yarvin, who pretends, I guess he is, or pretends to be like a libertarian monarchist, where the idea is like, oh, I want like this really maximal idea of individual freedom, and obviously the only way to get there is through an absolute king with, the total authority to nuke all of society if he wants to, or something like that. And to me, I just want to say, well, just read a goddamn book, man, right? Look at history. Ask yourself, like, have kings ever worked at doing any of this? And the answer is no. The kings are a terrible solution to this particular problem, right? That all these people on the right are basically saying, well, look, the left is going to destroy freedom, all this freedom that I've been talking about. The left is going to destroy it, and the only way to stop it is an equally strong or a stronger right that has a tyrant that just destroys the left. You see this rhetoric all over certain parts of the intellectual wing of MAGA these days, right? That Trump is attacking the universities and he's defunding the universities because the universities stopped defending free speech. And so now we need to destroy them to save them. And obviously it's easy to dismiss this stuff as kind of ahistorical nonsense. And I think it is. I think it is just nonsense. But it's compelling nonsense, and it's compelling in part because the censorious left that they're responding to is quite real. Is it a danger to free speech in America on a par with Trump? Absolutely not. But to be honest, just I've been around the block too many times. I've seen too many hate mobs spin up on the internet over inane stuff, right? Oh, you wrote a short story that I'm convinced is actually like crypto Nazi propaganda, and now 100,000 people are screaming at you on the internet and sending you death threats, right? This is the Isabel Fall story. You should look that one up if you're not familiar with it, right? But these are real problems if you're in these kinds of spaces. The fear that it generates in you that I think is fundamentally antithetical to this kind of mutual respect for freedom that I've been talking about, as so central to the liberal project. And for me, today, I'm going to try and bring this all back home. The liberal project has got to be about recovering these values of mutual respect for freedom, mutual respect for people who are different from you, who might have exercised their reason to come to different conclusions about their life or about the world or about things in the world that you think are important, and finding a way to live together on a basis of respect for disagreement, for humility about our own decisions, but also the courage of our own convictions. And balancing those two is tricky, but I don't know how we really live together without it. So to me, this is the way that the liberal project speaks to what's deepest in us. The liberal project, to respond to these kinds of right-wing grifters that I've been talking about, we need to be able to tell people, like, yeah, you have real problems, right? For example, like, yeah, kids these days, they're not actually getting, they're not coupling, they're not getting married, they're not finding dates. And like, that kind of sucks, man. Like, let's just be honest, that sucks. But the right wing is just selling you a comforting lie, right? A comforting, gauzy nostalgia that actually everything used to be better. And if you just close your eyes and stop thinking so hard and take some testosterone supplements, it will all be easy again. But the real truth of that, as Nietzsche would tell you, there's no escape from freedom, right? You can pretend to close your eyes to that open sea, but you are still on an open sea, eyes open or eyes shut. So, where do we go from here? Difficult question. But next week, I hope to wrap up this series by talking about future directions. Like, what is the unfinished business of the liberal project in the 21st century? What can we do to reconstitute it after its kind of evaporation during the end of history, right? When only today the right and the left seem to have any vitality to them. And also, that seems in each case to be kind of a false vitality, that they are full of rage but empty of content, right? How do we rebuild the liberal project going forwards? Um, well, join me next week when I'll have on our editor in chief, Adam Gurry, to talk about that. Thanks for listening.